So today we're starting Scratch Unit 3, where we talk about variables. So our agenda for today is to talk about first variable statements, how you can collect input from a user, ask them a question and have them give you a response and save it, joining statements together to put together maybe a line of text or together in some sort of statement, and then finally we're going to talk about commenting your code. So, first problem we want to kind of consider, imagine we have two glasses of water. You have a pink filled liquid glass and a blue filled liquid glass. And you want to switch sides. In other words, have the contents of the pink side go into the blue side and the contents of the blue side go into the pink side. So it's a swap of these fluids without just picking up the glass and moving it. You actually want the liquid to move. So if you think about that and how you could possibly do it, you realize it's not possible with just these two glasses. But if you add a third glass, you could figure out a way to pull it off. So think about how you would do that. We are going to use the same technique in order to do a swap of what we call variables. So let's talk a little bit about variables first. So an overview, if you want to think about variables as little containers, container 1, container 2, and then they're temporary. And those containers can contain a number or a word or a value. So we're going to start with having them contain numbers. So we're going to say variable 1 is going to be equal to 4. So we're going to set that variable to 4. And then variable 2, we're going to set it to 6. And then the trick is we want the 4 that was in 1 to end up in the 2 box and the 6 that was in 2 to end up in the 1 box. And the parameters are that you can only have one value can be in a box at any given time. And if you take a value out of a box, it is lost. You can only complete one operation at a time as well. So hopefully you can understand that one way you could do it is to use a little temporary box. And when you have this temporary box, you take whatever value you had in 2 and put it in the temporary box. Then you could put the value of 1 into 2. And then you can put the value of the temporary box back into 1. So having this little extra box is going to help you with that swap. So let's go ahead and give that a try. If we want to do that in Scratch, we're going to use what we call variables. So in Scratch, remember our control keys, we have our scripts, we have control right here, and we have data right here. So if we want to make a variable by creating this little blue button, make a variable, we can type what it is. In this case, we'll call it variable. Okay. Oh, of course we can't create it because we already have it. So here it is, variable. So let's go back to that PowerPoint. We can have several different blocks of code that can then manipulate that variable. And what we'll see is with this little down arrow is we can set whichever variables we might have established. So we can set it. We can change it. Change it by allows us to increment a variable by some specific number, by 1 or 2 or 5 or however you want to increment it. We might want to show the variable on our stage or hide it. Oftentimes when we're just dealing with variables or learning how to use them, we always show them so we can see what their values are at any given moment in time. So these are the blocks of code, and you'll see those right here. Set, change, show, hide. Okay. Now, if you want to think though about mathematics, so if you saw this expression, variable equals 0, and then you saw the expression variable equals variable plus 1, you would think, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense because the variable is 0, 0 equals 0 plus 1, and 0 does not equal 0 plus 1, 0 equals 0, so that doesn't make any sense, okay? So we have to start thinking about using these operators slightly differently when we're coding. So this is a symbol of equality when you're talking about math, but in computer science, this equals, it stands for gets equal to or is assigned to. So we'd say variable, okay, remember this is like an open box, is assigned to whatever the value of variable was before plus 1. So if before variable was set to 0, then variable gets equal to 0 plus 1. So after these two lines of code, if we say, well, what's the value of variable? You would say the variable is 1. So that's a really important mathematical expression that is not necessarily used the same way in computer science. In Scratch and in many other languages, we have the same issue. Now, if you want to do mathematical expressions, we do have those in Scratch. You'll find those in the green menu. And of course, the most obvious are plus, minus, multiply, and divide. So if you want to say 3 plus 3, you could set a variable equals, variable equals 3 plus 3, and it will get set equal to 6. Two that you might not be familiar with is the mod and round. And modular arithmetic is really confusing, but can be really useful in certain circumstances. We'll play with some of those over the period. But the idea of a mod is take two numbers, divide the second into the first, and give the remainder. That's what a mod does. So if you say 7 mod 3, 7 divided by 3 is 6. I'm sorry, 7 divided by 3 is 2 with 1 remainder. So 7 mod 3 just gives you the remainder, which is 1. And round is going to round a value to the nearest integer. And then finally you have this thing here, the square with the little triangle. If you click on that little triangle, up is going to pop a whole bunch of mathematical operations that you can use that are really helpful in coding and gaming. Okay, so lots of mathematical operations. So you'll play with those on this particular lab. Okay, so let's look at our swap variables demo and think about what's happening here. Okay, so let's go back to our project page and we read our instructions. Click the green flag to enter values for variables 1 and 2. You can then swap the values. Press the space bar to clear out values. Unfortunately, the space bar is not working for me right now because I'm doing the screencast. So it has another function in my screencast. So let's go ahead and run the code and see what happens. Okay, so if I hit the green flag, it's going to say, what is the variable value of variable 1? I'm going to give it the variable value of 10. So variable 1 is going to get the value 10, and then I hit enter, or you can click the little arrow key. And then what is the value of variable 2? I'm going to make it 20, and I hit enter. Now what you can see is that value 1 is 10, value 2 is 20. Now I want to swap those values, and so value 1 will get 20, value 2 will get 10. And I click the button swap, and you should see that they have swapped. Okay, so this is the same thing we're doing with the water glasses. How did we do it? Let's look over our code over here. When the green flag is kicked, we have first 3 variables. And the first thing we typically do when we have a series of variables is we initialize them. We always do that at the very beginning of the program. So I'm going to set temp equal to 0, set the value 1 equal to 0, value 2 equal to 0, and I'm just going to click the green flag and you can see that those values have been set equal to 0. Stop it for now. Then it's going to say, what is the value of a variable 1? And wait. Okay, and so it waits with that little question there. It waits and waits for you to put a number in. When you put a number and hit enter, it's going to take whatever you number and give the value answer to that. So answer is going to become 10. And then it's going to set value 1, the variable, to be equal to 10. Then you ask for the second one. What is the value of variable 2? 20. And then this will set the value of variable 2 to 20. Okay, so that's how it's going to work. So that sets up the value. So if I run it right now, again, I'll go 10, enter, and 20, enter. Okay, great. Now, if I want to swap the values, I click on this button. Okay, so imagine, now I've just swapped it so that worked. Remember how if you have a sensing, so that if a sprite is clicked, there you can have an event happen. So we say when this sprite is clicked, we set temp1 equal to value 1. We set value 1 equal to value 2. So that's where we just switched them. And then value 2 gets to be equal to whatever that temp was. So that's like pouring the water in one glass and then switching the glass to the other water and then getting the temporary glass and pouring it to the second glass. So that's swapping values. Okay, moving on. We're going to keep going down. Okay. So we can use variables to make our code more interesting. So if you guys remember the polygon code that we did, we're going to take a second look at that. So simple predictive variables, allowing sprites to interact. We have a couple of different variables here. You can see we have a sprite size, it's called 5. We have number of sides is 10, and we have a scale is 0. So these are each variables, and this is what happens when you say show variable. So let's go ahead and run the code. Click the larger or smaller button to make the larger or smaller. So the cat told us what to do. So if I click larger, it makes the cat larger. Smaller, it makes the cat smaller. Notice that the sprite size is changing. So somewhere in my code, I'm changing the size of the sprite. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Finally, let's do the next example. So I click this button. How many sides would you like? Now I'm going to draw a polygon. So I'm going to start with 5 sides. And I'll hit enter. And it draws a little pentagon. Let's do another one. And I want it to be 10-sided. And it draws a 10-sided figure. Okay, so it is taking that number of sides, and it is taking that number of sides and putting it into a little script that will draw the polygon based on that number of sides. Now, I'm not going to give this away how you do it because it's going to be part of your lab. But let's look at the very first sprite. So we'll look at not that one, but this one. This is for we make it smaller or larger. When this sprite is kicked, so the smaller button, when the smaller button is kicked, it sets the scale to 0.5 times whatever the scale is. So there's your operator. Remember, operator's over here in the green. So I take 0.5 times whatever scale you started with, okay? And then you're going to change it. Notice we do the green flag, it shows that little smaller button, but then when I receive example 2, in other words, when I click the next example, that button goes away and we're just going to be doing the pentagon or the hexagon or whatever size figure we're going to do. Larger is very similar. You set your scale to 2 times the scale. So now you want to get bigger, you're going to double it. Okay. Now, notice what I've added over here. These are called comments, and you're going to have to start getting the habit of including comments in your code. So the idea is whenever you have a big block of code, if it's long and complicated, you want to have more than one comment. But you want to explain what it is that your chunk of code, meaning several blocks, does. This allows a sprite to act as a button. This equation doesn't make mathematical sense. Like 2 scale equals 2 times scale. That doesn't make sense from a mathematical perspective, but what it does do is assign the value of scale to be equal to 2 times whatever the value of scale was before. Okay? Remember, this is assigning a value to the variable stored at this location scale. If you want to comment a chunk of code, what you do is you hit the control key or the right click, and you can bring up this series of things and you can choose add comment, and then you can type it in. And you're going to be required to be adding comments to all of your code kind of from here on out. Okay, keep going. Larger, smaller. Okay. So you and your partner should try to come up with a formula. Write pseudocode. In other words, write it in English. Like, how would you, given the number of sides of a polygon, how would you create a 3-sided polygon? Like, come up with a little chunk of code that would allow you to do it. And then figure out how you would modify the code to come up with a 4-sided, and then a 5-sided, and look for the pattern. And once you figure out the pattern, then you can write the code to complete it. So when you get to the problem where you're going to be writing polygons in your lab, make sure you work with your partner to try to help figure that out. Okay. Let's see. All right, join statements. In our control characters, we have join statements, and they are it is right here. So if you say join hello world, that's going to create the combination of these two things. And you can also join variables. So if you wanted to join, this is not going to make any sense, but the number of sides, and you want to join the scale, then you just get 100 sides. And the scale is 5. So that's meaningless at this point, but that's how you do it. You grab things and you drop them in. So you can use that to come up with phrases of combinations of variables. So if you have the variable where the name, and the name is Samantha, and you have favorite activity, and the favorite activity is tennis, and then favorite food is pistachios, okay, so you have those 3 variables, you would use this join statement. And if you start in the inside part, it says join favorite food, so it's going to be pistachios, exclamation point. And pistachios, exclamation point is joined with and. So we get and pistachios, exclamation point. And then we take that whole thing and we join it with tennis and pistachios. And then we join that with loves. And then we join all of that with Samantha. It's very tedious in Scratch, but it's powerful. You can get it to work and become some interesting statements. Finally, click the block of code in order to insert a comment. Every coding block should have a comment explaining its purpose and how it works. So this one is explaining how swapping values. And it's going to seem repetitive because you're basically using English to describe what your code should make pretty clear, but it is a very important habit. many computer science instructors will say that you should have as many comments as you do lines of code. It's really important for a coder who comes in behind you to understand what it is you're doing in your particular code, and that you do that by putting in comments. Okay, so you are now ready to start your pair programming. In the pair programming assignment, let's go back up to the top. Pair programming assignment, you are going to create a little animation for a rocket and have the rocket launch up the stage. And then when the green flag is clicked, and then it's going to move at constant speed. And later on, you're going to try to figure out how to change the speed by changing the variable of speed. You may not use the glide to command for this exercise. You have to use move, or you can use change x by or change y by and play around and see how those work. But get a variable that you can edit or change and have that rocket move up the stage. Okay? Good luck.